What should you do when salvation doesn't match your expectations? Can you make it yield its promises, performing your desires? Is faith the answer? How much do you need? Can more faith be the solution? Or are these the wrong questions? In chapter 10, verse 19-31, the book has outlined the significance and the reality of being in union with Jesus. Where Jesus is physically, we are also spiritually, and vice versa. In the reality of our salvation, we have received magnificent promises, but our experience of this salvation is still incomplete. Although Jesus has achieved full atonement, chapter 9, verse 28 and chapter 10, verse 13 have made clear that these achievements will not be fully seen until Jesus returns to be physically reunited with his people. So how can Christians be encouraged to live out the instructions in chapter 10, verses 21 to 25, in the reality of today's sufferings, testings, and temptations? Life is full of distractions and discouragements. Many Christians begin with enthusiasm and get drawn away or become depressed because of failures of themselves, or perhaps of how they think that God has let them down. Even though saved and redeemed, and in the process of being perfected, life as a Christian is not easy. I know that the experience of chapter 10, verses 26 to 31 is not foreign to us. In discouragement and also in prosperity, there are many doors into the enemy's traps. So what is the answer? The book now gives a long passage from chapter 10, verse 32 to chapter 12, verse 2, in order to counter discouragement and to draw the focus from our eyes and attention away from ourselves. The large portion of the study is chapter 11. This is often referred to as a roll call of faith. Yet we shall discover that the chapter treats faith as a characteristic, not a commodity. We shall also find that the focus is not on the men and women of faith, but on the utter faithfulness of God. Our confidence rests not on men or women as examples, but on the complete dependability of God. We shall consider our passage in 3 portions. 1. The first section, verses 32 to 39 of chapter 10. In this, the book argues that our initial experience of salvation proves its truth and reality, and points us to the confidence that we can take from the reliability of Jesus, the leader of our salvation. The second portion covers verses 1 to 16 of chapter 11. These verses introduce us to the characteristic of faith, and then begin to explore the faithfulness of God in the individual histories from Abel to Sarah. The third part, from chapter 11, verse 17 to chapter 12, verse 2, challenges us to open up our understanding and appreciations of God's dependability, especially when things get very difficult, discouraging, or even seemingly overwhelming. So, part 1. But remember the former days, when after being enlightened you endured a great conflict of sufferings, partly by being made a public spectacle through reproaches and tribulations, and partly by becoming sharers with those who were so treated. For you showed sympathy to the prisoners, and accepted joyfully the seizure of your property, knowing that you have for yourselves a better possession and a lasting one. Therefore, do not throw away your confidence, which has a great reward. For you have need of endurance, so that when you have done the will of God, you may receive what was promised. For yet in a very little while he who is coming will come, and will not delay. But my righteous one shall live by faith, and if he shrinks back, my soul has no pleasure in him. But we are not of those who shrink back to destruction, but of those who have faith to the preserving of the soul. Verses 32 to 35. Observe that verse 32 talks about the point of entering into salvation as being enlightened, drawing upon the picture of the conversion experience of Saul, or Paul, in which he was transformed through the sudden appearance of a light from heaven brighter than the noonday sun when on the road to Damascus. Hence, conversion is often referred to as seeing the light. The text thus addresses those who can relate to Paul's experience, not necessarily in the physical sense, but in the appreciation that the salvation that God gives is a dynamic changing of the values and perceptions of the repentant rebel. So, for those who have been joined with Jesus, the challenge is to remember the former days. Remember when your heart rejoiced at the loss of the burden of sin, to borrow the phrase from John Bunyan's Pilgrim's Progress. Through God's forgiveness and the wonder of the touch of the Holy Spirit within you. Remember when the fellowship of God's people was real and true, even though sharing in that fellowship may have meant accepting economic deprivation or diminution, or even personal suffering. But the point of this instruction is not to wax nostalgic. It is a hard-nosed argument. If you had spiritual life then, you still have it. That is the sense of verse 35. Therefore, do not throw away your confidence, which has a great reward. We should note carefully that this does not say or mean, don't lose or abandon your salvation. As we have seen, that is not possible. Neither does it say, don't lose your determination, victory is just around the corner. It is not like being in a battle where one final effort is needed to secure a victory. There is no battle to be fought whose outcome is in doubt. The book has just told us in detail that Jesus has completely achieved the victory over sin and death. Christians are not called upon to fight or to work to achieve their salvation. That is already secure. The encouragement is, do not throw away your confidence. Again, the language is striking. The text refers to carelessly throwing away something that is of great value. In chapter 4, the book urged its readers to allow the Holy Spirit to test our professions of faith. Someone who has tested and proved their faith in the way that the book sets out in chapter 4 can have a confidence in their possession of the salvation that Jesus has won. And that is of great reassuring value as they seek to live out the life that God gives us here. To abandon that confidence is only to give needless heartache and worry. Note again, however, that it is the confidence in salvation, not the salvation itself, that is in view here. Whether we hold on to the confidence or throw it away, the salvation is secure because that depends on the merits and achievements of Jesus, not of us. And chapters 9 and 10a have shown those to be unassailable. We should now observe that the unction to hold on to our confidence is because the confidence itself brings great reward. This is the opportunity now to enjoy the living fellowship of God, united in spirit with the Son of God and present with him in the heavenly holy place, and also to enter into the fellowship of his people. To live in the enjoyment of this total fellowship is true reward. To throw away this confidence is like arriving at a place of great beauty and then putting on a blindfold. The beauty around us is unaltered, but we would see nothing of it. So it is with the Christian who loses sight of the beauty of the fellowship with God that salvation brings nigh. Verses 36 to 37. The argument that begins in verse 36 runs through to the end of chapter 12. It is interesting that while the book calls the fellowship that comes from holding on to our confidence our reward, it calls the eternal blessings of salvation the promises of God. This is the final achievement of every prophecy of good or promise of reward that the whole of the Bible contains. We can easily see that those blessings are not yet experienced. But the writer of Hebrews sees them coming in a little while. Thus the book urges us to endure, because this world is not forever, and the promises of God are as dependable as he is faithful. Endurance is relevant because we do not know how long it will be before God calls an end to time and ushers in the consummation of salvation. There is in the will of God a delay to allow men to come to the throne of grace to receive mercy. This delay is not because time is out of control or because God is waiting for an opportunistic moment. This is underlined in the text by the use in verses 37 to 38 of a quotation from the small book of Habakkuk. As with other Old Testament quotations in the book of Hebrews, the text is drawn from the Septuagint translation, which gives the quotation a messianic focus. Thus we read, "For yet in a very little while he who is coming will come, and will not delay." To use the time of waiting may seem like delay, as if God is late in fulfilling his promises. However, the writer of Hebrews echoes the Septuagint of Habakkuk 2 verse 3. God may seem to be slow from our perspective, yet of this we can be absolutely sure. The Messiah will return, and with him will come the fulfillment of all of God's promises. And this is also the point that Peter makes in 2 Peter 3 verses 4 to 10. So we come to verses 38 and 39. Having given this explanation of the need for endurance, the text now reinforces the confidence that we can have while we await God's time. The quotation from Habakkuk continues. Unlike the use of the quotation by Paul in Romans 1 verse 17, which, drawing from the Hebrew text, makes living by faith the touchstone of the individual believer, thus the just shall live by faith. But as we have noted, the quotation in Hebrews is drawn from the Septuagint. Here the endurance by faith is not by us, but is a defining feature of the Messiah. It is by his endurance that the true Messiah will validate himself as my righteous one. Jesus has, by his endurance, proved that he is the righteous one of the Septuagint text of Habakkuk. It is to this triumphant Messiah who has endured to the uttermost that we are united. The genitive cases in verse 39 show and underline that it is not the virtue of the followers that is at issue, but that of the leader, the author, captain, leader of salvation. It is not our endurance that the passage is talking about. Our salvation does not depend on us and on our enduring to the preservation of the soul. The text does not say in a pious hope, we are not those who shrink back to destruction. No, we are united to be one spirit with Jesus, who has already succeeded. This optimism is therefore not a pious platitude or wild hope. It is the expression of a certainty based on what the book has been teaching us about the union between the believer and the Saviour. Those who have come to Jesus for forgiveness and a new covenant relationship with God have entered into a substantive union with the glorified Son of Hebrews 1. In this sense, Christianity is not a religion. It is a dynamic unifying in spirit of Jesus and each one individually of his disciples. Yet, as we have observed, life for the Christian in this waiting time can be challenging and often frustrating. But this interlude is not a barren time to be frittered away. It is a time to be lived in the reality of the union with Jesus, to learn aspects of him that can only be learned here. To demonstrate this, the book now develops an unusual presentation of living by faith. And so we come to part 2, the first 16 verses of chapter 11. Now faith is the assurance of things hoped for, the conviction of things not seen. For by it the men of old gained approval. By faith we understand that the worlds were prepared by the word of God, so that what is seen was not made out of things which are visible. By faith Abel offered to God a better sacrifice than Cain, through which he obtained the testimony that he was righteous, God testifying about his gifts. And through faith, though he is dead, he still speaks. By faith Enoch was taken up so that he would not see death, and he was not found because God took him up. For he obtained the witness that before his being taken up he was pleasing to God. And without faith it is impossible to please him, for he who comes to God must believe that he is, and that he is a rewarder of those who seek him. By faith Noah, being warned by God about things yet not seen, in reverence prepared an ark for the salvation of his household, by which he condemned the world, and became an heir of the righteousness which is according to faith. By faith Abraham, when he was called, obeyed by going out to a place which he was to receive for an inheritance. And he went out, not knowing where he was going. By faith he lived as an alien in the land of promise, as in a foreign land, dwelling in tents with Isaac and Jacob, fellow heirs of the same promise. For he was looking for the city which has foundations, whose architect and builder is God. By faith even Sarah herself received ability to conceive, even beyond the proper time of life, since she considered him faithful who had promised. Therefore there was born even of one man, and him as good as dead at that, as many descendants as the stars of heaven in number, and innumerable as the sand which is by the seashore. All these died in faith, without receiving the promises, but having seen them, and having welcomed them from a distance, and having confessed that they were strangers and exiles on the earth. For those who say such things make it clear that they are seeking a country of their own. And indeed, if they had been thinking of that country from which they went out, they would have had opportunity to return. But as it is, they desire a better country, that is, a heavenly one. Therefore, God is not ashamed to be called their God, for he has prepared a city for them. Verse 1 contains perhaps the best known definition of faith in the Bible. What may be surprising is that it is not in fact the kind of statement that we think that it is. When we look carefully at Hebrews 11 verse 1, we should observe that the verse is in the form of a philosophical description of faith. It is true that faith is that which enables our relationship with God, but the text here is saying something bigger. The purpose of the definition is to show that using faith is in fact the natural state for man, and it distinguishes him from animals. Man can conceptualize. That is, he can invent and he can create something that had not existed or been imagined before. Thus, the very function of creativity is an exercise in faith. Faith reaches into the unknown and gives a substance to what is otherwise just a dream or a fantasy. Faith spurs man to achieve what to animals is impossible. It is not just that man has a larger brain than the animals have. It is that to man has been gifted the ability to have faith, to press on beyond what is real here and now, and bring a new reality to fruition. This is the way that man is. The Bible asserts that this is the way that God made him. Faith is that which reaches into the beyond, past the visible or sensory discernible present, to conceive the not yet. In this sense, man's ability to exercise faith is a feature of the image of God in which he was created. Thus, faith is not a characteristic that is alien to us. We were created with the capacity to use faith. The point is that man is not limited to relating only to what he can see or touch. In a sense, we might say that faith is amoral, not immoral, but amoral. It is a characteristic that can be used for good or evil. See Paul's condemnation in Romans 1 verse 30 of those who are inventors of evil. The Bible also suggests that when we give way to our animal lusts, we are acting beneath the dignity of the humanity in which we were created. In coming to God for salvation, we have to reach out beyond what we can see or touch. We need to enter into relationship with the God who is invisible and to our appreciation intangible. To do this, we need to use the phenomenon of faith that God put into us in our creation. Through faith, we can go beyond what is seen or touched and act in accordance with something that we cannot see, touch, or prove by physical science. This should not be confused with animal instinct. It goes far beyond instinct. Exercising faith in coming to God is not asking of man something that is alien to his nature. It is not asking him to do something difficult. Thus, faith is simply that part of our nature that makes it easy to relate to the God that we do not see and cannot touch. Yet faith in God is not a leap in the dark. It is not a cosmic gamble. The basis of our faith in God is the revealed truth about our reality outside of ourselves and our world that God has given to us in His Word. Verses 2 and 3. When we recognize that God's Word is true and act upon it, we enter into a relationship with Him through faith. Verse 2 affirms that it has been so from the beginning. In verse 3 is a tight argument. We cannot, even today, prove the origin of matter, so that we need to reach out beyond ourselves to accept the Bible's claim that God created all things by His command. The resultant conclusion has a double point. First, we learn that our universe has been brought into being from nothing. We did not observe this happening, nor can we prove it. Yet when we treat this as a true fact, we reach out beyond that which we can see or touch. We exercise faith. And this faith is based upon what God has revealed in His Word. The second point, however, is that logically, if what is seen was not made out of things that are visible, then God created out of nothing. And in creating out of nothing, God Himself is demonstrating the nature of faith. The joy of creativity is a consequence of the divine attribute of faith. Thus, when we read about the men or women who follow in this chapter, we can see that it is not them who are our inspirations and encouragements, but it is the faithfulness of God that is our confidence. Verse 4. We should not be diverted into seeking more in the mention of Abel than the text gives. We are not told in what way Abel offered a better sacrifice. It is sufficient that he did and that God accepted him. Thus he is treated as having faith in God. The focus is on the strange statement that though he is dead, he still speaks. Abel was the first person on earth to die. His life was cut down before it had barely begun. It left so much potential unfulfilled. He had so much to do and so much to say. Thus the reference to Abel still speaking is not an allusion to the cry for vengeance that came from his blood in Genesis 4 verse 10. That cry is an appeal to the justice of God. And the blood of any man, even those not dying in faith, have the same claim to God's justice. Abel's continued speaking is an indication that the faithfulness of God is not overcome or defeated by man's death. Abel, in the faithfulness of God, still lives. See the put down of the Sadducees by Jesus in Matthew 22 and also in Mark 12 and Luke 20. The triumph of Abel over death is not his faith, but God's faithfulness. Verse 5 continues with another person who did not live out a normal, for that time, lifespan. Enoch lived only 365 years. Although that seems very long to us, it was only a short time in the context of Genesis 5. However, Enoch's life was not cut short in the same way as Abel's. The Genesis record is reflected vividly in Hebrews. Enoch did not see death because God took him directly to himself. Enoch lived in fellowship with God. He walked with God. And God took him into the realm where that fellowship would be even better. In the case of Abel, we saw that God is faithful to deliver even in death. And in Enoch, we see the glory of God's faithfulness towards those who choose to fellowship with him. Verse 6 underlines that when man puts his faith into or unto God, he passes through the doorway of entering into God's faithfulness. As we have suggested, verse 1 points up faith as a divine-given characteristic of mankind. However, men may choose to have faith only in themselves. The book of Proverbs has, amongst others, 2 comments. Trust in the Lord with all your heart, and do not lean on your own understanding. And later on, he who trusts in his own heart is a fool. It is not having faith that leads to God's blessing, but it is the use of our faith to connect to God's faithfulness. Verse 7. Noah was given instruction by God, and he showed what he thought of God by his obedience. The Genesis account of Noah is revealing. His father, Lamech, regarded God as the source of life's problems. In consequence, he exploited his son. This is revealed if we contrast the age at which Noah fathered his first child with that of the others named in Genesis 5. Yet, instead of this producing resentment of God in Noah, he seems rather to have learned the righteousness of God and earned the description of him as a preacher of righteousness, as recorded in 2 Peter 2 verse 5. Psalm 37 testifies, I have been young, and now I am old, yet I have not seen the righteous forsaken, or his descendants begging bread. Noah's love of righteousness was recognized by God, and in bringing him and his family through the flood, God demonstrated the truth of Psalm 37 verse 25. God's faithfulness to the righteous is unshakable. Happy we can be that in Jesus we have been covered by his righteousness and can therefore depend on God's eternal faithfulness. Verses 8 to 12 take us to the call of God to Abraham to leave a built-up city and become a tent-dwelling nomad. More importantly, they introduce us to the promises given by God. Our salvation is rooted on God's promises to Abraham. Thus, the reliability of the promises of God is of vital importance. In Hebrews 11, the text treats the promise of the land as to Abraham and highlights the promise of the progeny as pertaining to Sarah. Abraham and Sarah saw the beginnings of the nation, Isaac, in their lifetime. But even at the end of his life, the only piece of the promised land that Abraham possessed was the grave that he had bought. Yet the key to the passage is attributed to Sarah, not normally held up as a paragon of faith. In verse 11, we read that Sarah considered him faithful who had promised. The assurance of the delivery of the promises was not in what they saw or received, but in the faithfulness of the one making the promises. Truly, the heart of this chapter is the faithfulness of God. Verses 13 to 16 begin, however, with a seeming challenge. All these died without receiving the promises. Yet the greatness of their appreciation of the faithfulness of God ensured that they were not in the least perturbed. And the passage ends with one of the most wonderful and daring statements in the Bible. God will not only deliver his promises, but the quality of the things promised will not be in any way disappointing. If they were to be, then God would have cause to be ashamed, but that shall not happen, because what God has prepared for those who love him, trust him, is far beyond our imagination and expectation. And so we come to part 3, that is chapter 11, verse 17, right through to chapter 12, verse 2. By faith, Abraham, when he was tested, offered up Isaac, and he who had received the promises was offering up his only begotten son. It was he to whom it was said, "In Isaac your descendant shall be called." He considered that God is able to raise people even from the dead, from which he also received him back as a type. By faith, Isaac blessed Jacob and Esau, even regarding things to come. By faith, Jacob, as he was dying, blessed each of the sons of Joseph and worshipped, leaning on the top of his staff. By faith, Joseph, when he was dying, made mention of the exodus of the sons of Israel and gave orders concerning his bones. By faith, Moses, when he was born, was hidden for 3 months by his parents because they saw he was a beautiful child, and they were not afraid of the king's edict. By faith, Moses, when he had grown up, refused to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter, choosing rather to endure ill treatment with the people of God than to enjoy the passing pleasures of sin. Considering the reproach of Christ greater riches than the treasures of Egypt, for he was looking to the reward. By faith he left Egypt, not fearing the wrath of the king, for he endured as seeing him who is unseen. By faith he kept the Passover and the sprinkling of the blood, so that he who destroyed the firstborn would not touch them. By faith they passed through the Red Sea, as though they were passing through dry land, and the Egyptians, when they attempted it, were drowned. By faith the walls of Jericho fell down after they had been encircled for 7 days. By faith Rahab the harlot did not perish along with those who were disobedient, after she welcomed the spies in peace. And what more shall I say? For time will fail me if I tell of Gideon, Barak, Samson, Jephthah, of David and Samuel and the prophets, who by faith conquered kingdoms, performed acts of righteousness, obtained promises, shut the mouths of lions, quenched the power of fire, escaped the edge of the sword, from weakness were made strong, became mighty in war, put foreign armies to flight. Women received back their dead by resurrection. Others were tortured, not accepting their release so that they might obtain a better resurrection. And others experienced mockings and scourgings, yes, also chains and imprisonment. They were stoned, they were sawn in two, they were tempted, they were put to death with the sword. They went about in sheepskins, in goatskins, being destitute, afflicted, ill-treated, men of whom the world was not worthy, wandering in deserts and mountains and caves and holes in the ground. And all these, having gained approval through their faith, did not receive what was promised, because God had provided something better for us, so that, apart from us, they would not be made perfect. Therefore, since we have so great a cloud of witnesses surrounding us, let us also lay aside every encumbrance and the sin which so easily entangles us, and let us run with endurance the race that is set before us, fixing our eyes on Jesus, the author and perfecter of faith, who for the joy set before him endured the cross, despising the shame, and has sat down at the right hand of the throne of God. The second part of chapter 11 takes us into the experiences of men and women that are more complex and disconcerting than those in verses 4 to 16. In verses 17 to 19, we read about Abraham's dilemma when confronted by God's call to sacrifice Isaac. Yet even in that conflict of promise and command, God's faithfulness held true. Verses 20 to 21 provide a disconcerting parallel. Both Isaac and Jacob gave the preferential blessing to the younger son, or in Jacob's case, grandson. However, while Jacob knew what he was doing, Isaac thought that he was blessing the elder son. How then can his blessing be in faith? In these patriarchal blessings, the parent is passing the child from his parental control to the control of God. Isaac's faith was not in what he thought he was doing, blessing Esau, but in passing his children into God's sovereign care. God's faithfulness guarantees that what we entrust to his care is just that. It is in his care. God's faithfulness and wisdom did not fail Isaac or Jacob. And in Paul's second letter to Timothy, he expresses the same assurance. For this reason I also suffer these things, but I am not ashamed. For I know whom I have believed. And I am convinced that he is able to guard what I have to him until that day. And so we come to verses 22 to 31. This passage displays a careful and deliberate construction. It begins with the first reference to the exodus from Egypt, in the reference to Joseph, and it finishes with the conclusion of the exodus, the entry into the promised land, in the reference to Rahab. The main focus of these verses, however, is probably the greatest man of the Old Testament, possibly of the Bible. We read about the one whom God described in Numbers 12 as unparalleled. Then Miriam and Aaron spoke against Moses. Then the Lord came down in a pillar of cloud and stood at the doorway of the tent, and he called Aaron and Miriam. When they had both come forward, he said, "Hear now my words. If there is a prophet among you, I, the Lord, shall make myself known to him in a vision. I shall speak with him in a dream. Not so with my servant Moses. He is faithful in all my household. With him I speak mouth to mouth, even openly, and not in dark sayings. And he beholds the form of the Lord. Why then were you not afraid to speak against my servant, against Moses?" We met this quotation earlier in study 4. The references to Moses in Hebrews 11 begin as we might expect. In verses 23 to 27, Moses' early life is briefly summarized, and then in verses 28 to 29, the deliverance in the Passover and the exodus from Egypt is even more briefly referenced. The literary flow then takes us directly from the exodus out of Egypt to the entry into the land of Canaan in verses 30 to 31. It ought to shock us that what is omitted is perhaps the greatest part of the life and the ministry of Moses. There is no reference to the giving of the Decalogue, the cutting of the covenant at Sinai, the periods that Moses spent alone with God on the mountaintop, the intercession for the sinful people in which Moses offered himself as a substitute, in a type of the future atonement offering of Christ, or of the leading of the nation through 40 years of wandering in the wilderness, during which the testimony of Numbers 12 is given. And nothing is said about his delivering and interpreting God's law. This absence is not because of neglect on the part of the author of Hebrews, but because of a giant shadow that has been cast across this ministry. Unlike Abel, Noah, Abraham, and the others, Moses died a failure. He was in fact put to death by God. In Numbers 27 we read, "Then the Lord said to Moses, Go up to this mountain of Abarim, and see the land which I have given to the sons of Israel. And when you have seen it, you too shall be gathered to your people, as Aaron your brother was. For in the wilderness of Zin, during the strife of the congregation, you rebelled against my command to treat me as holy before their eyes at the water. These are the waters of Meribah, of Kadesh, in the wilderness of Zin." Lest we should doubt the text, the same sentence of death is recorded in Deuteronomy. "And the Lord spoke to Moses that very same day, saying, Go up to this mountain of the Abarim, Mount Nebo, which is in the land of Moab opposite Jericho, and look at the land of Canaan, which I am giving to the sons of Israel for a possession. Then die on the mountain where you ascend, and be gathered to your people, as Aaron your brother died on Mount Hor and was gathered to his people. Because you broke faith with me in the midst of the sons of Israel at the waters of Meribah Kadesh, in the wilderness of Zin, because you did not treat me as holy in the midst of the sons of Israel. For you shall see the land at a distance, but you shall not go there, into the land which I am giving the sons of Israel." That Moses did not die naturally is affirmed in the final testimony in Deuteronomy. In Deuteronomy 34, verse 5, we read, "So Moses, the servant of the Lord, died there in the land of Moab, according to the word of the Lord. And he buried him in the valley in the land of Moab, opposite Beth Peor, but no man knows his burial place to this day. Although Moses was 120 years old when he died, his eye was not dim, nor his vigour abated." Moses died in full vigour of life. His life had not run out. God put him to death, gently and lovingly, but emphatically. We should be careful, however, not to read these verses as an overall assessment of Moses. They do not have that function. Their purpose is to underpin that our salvation rests not on our ability to emulate even the best of men or women, but solely on the character of God and our confidence in the faithfulness and dependability of God. It is because God is unwaveringly faithful to his character that we can have any confidence in anything, even down to the expectation that the sun will rise tomorrow. This is the message in God's declaration in Malachi. For I, the Lord, do not change. Therefore, you, O sons of Jacob, are not consumed. This is our guarantee, and it will be refreshed in Hebrews chapter 13. Jesus Christ is the same yesterday and today and forever. Moses remains the giant of human faithfulness to God, as the Numbers 12 testimony has given. His ministry to God and to man at and following Sinai is beyond human comparison and is essential to our appreciation of salvation and the work of Jesus. So, lest we misread the significance of this treatment in Hebrews 11, we should observe that in a way Moses did get into the land when he appeared together with Elijah alongside Jesus on the Mount of Transfiguration. And we find that in Matthew 17, Mark 9 and Luke 9. To refresh again, the point in the Hebrews 11 construction is to impress upon us in a very dramatic presentation and construction the emphatic faithfulness of God to his holiness. God's holiness shall never be diluted. His faithfulness in holiness is absolute. God has been faithful to man in overcoming death, sharing fellowship, rewarding righteousness, and in giving unbreakable promises. However, his fundamental faithfulness is to his own character, which in Exodus 34 is presented as his glory. And so we come now to verses 32 to 40. In these verses, the experiences of the men and women of faith become more and more difficult and challenging, leading to the mention of many who are not even named, losing lives and livelihoods without seeing the delivery of God's promises. Yet they were not invisible to God. Verse 38 tells us what God thought of them. God valued them as men of whom the world was not worthy. And although verse 39 underlines that they did not receive the fulfillment of the promises, the text declares that all of the promises of God lead to our time. And so we come to chapter 12, verses 1 to 2. The examples in chapter 11 are not our models for encouragement. Our eyes should not be on them, but on Jesus, who demonstrated both the faithfulness of God and the fulfillment of the promises. Jesus is the first and the last of faith. In him, all of the requirement for God's blessings have been met, and so he has become the evidence of the faithfulness of the promises of God. His seating at the right hand of God is proof of that. Note, however, that this present enthronement is not the joy set before him of verse 2. That remains the future sharing of all of the physical blessings of God with his disciples in the perfection of righteousness. Later in chapter 12, we shall discover more of this. I once set a challenge to a Bible study group to attempt to summarize the Bible in 4 words. The verbal quartet that I had in mind was, God can be trusted. This message seems to me to permeate the whole of the Bible from the beginning to the end. It was the rock over which Eve and Adam stumbled. It is also the banner under which the King of Kings and Lord of Lords will appear when he comes to reign. And so we read in Revelation chapter 19, verse 11. And I saw heaven opened, and behold a white horse, and he who sat upon it is called Faithful and True. And in righteousness he judges and wages war, and his eyes are a flame of fire, and upon his head are many diadems, and he has a name written upon him, which no one knows except himself. And he is clothed with a robe dipped in blood, and his name is called the Word of God. Can it be any wonder then that it is the faithfulness of God that must be our confidence and encouragement in days that are sometimes challenging, even disappointing, when God does not answer our prayers in the way that we want or expect, and discouraging? What God has promised for blessing of his people and judgment for the godless, he will deliver in the time of his wisdom.